Hello, my name is Julie Cook, and I'm the author of The Titanic and the City of Widows It Left Behind. And this is an online lecture and chat for God's House Tower in Southampton. So, hello.
Hello, Julie.
Hello.
Lovely to be talking to you today. Thanks for taking the time out.
Thanks for having me.
Let's dive in with our questions then. So, can you tell us a bit more? What's the story of William and Emily?
Well, William and Emily. William was my great-grandfather, and
Okay.
he was a stoker on Titanic. So he worked in the boiler rooms of the ship, shoveling the coal into the furnaces
Wow.
that fueled Titanic, which was a pretty back-breaking job, and physically exhausting and mentally draining. They worked really long hours, and they were really quite notorious. They were called the Black Gang because they were so, covered in soot and known for heavy drinking and fighting. And, so this was my ancestor. And Emily was his wife, but it was quite a love story because they met when they were both agricultural workers in the Ealing area of Southampton. And they got married on Christmas Day because it was the only day they could get off.
Wow.
And then they moved to Southampton for sort of a better life, really, because he got a job working on the ships as I say, as a boiler room man on various ships. And so when he got the job on Titanic, it was like the chance of a lifetime, because although it wasn't great money, it was £6 a month, which was slightly more than he'd got before on sort of coal transportation liners. And they had 5 children. So really Titanic was his chance to earn a bit more money for his 5 children and Emily.
Wow, very cool. Well, that is a really tough job. I mean, sometimes you think people work hard nowadays.
Yeah,
We need to put that
exactly.
into context. You try shoveling coal on a ship, for £6 a month. That's a hard job.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, you're right. And it was on Titanic, it was 4-hour shifts non-stop and then 4 hours off. So he would do, and 4 hours in that room, it was sort of 49, 50 degrees centigrade. It was really, really hot.
Wow.
You were up against the furnace with the molten debris sort of spitting out at you. So, hideous injuries happened, people just carried on. I mean, they were really, really hard, the stokers. So, so that was William's job.
Well, next time I say I've had a hard day's work, I'll just think again. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. You can't say that anymore.
No.
Yeah.
Julie, the Titanic was such an iconic moment in Southampton's history. What was the effect on Southampton immediately and then longer term?
I say immediately, just absolute shock. I mean, obviously, in a world without Twitter and Facebook and 24-hour news that we all take for granted now, initially the news came through in such sort of infuriatingly slow dribs and drabs. So first of all, there were wireless telegrams sent over saying, oh, it's all right, everybody's safe. Titanic definitely can't sink. Everyone's on boats, everyone's safe. So at first people thought, okay, they're probably going to be all right. Then, of course, other news came through, and we've probably all seen in Southampton, certainly, some of the old pictures of the Daily Echo placard wheeling young boys saying everyone's dead, loss of life, so suddenly the news got more and more horrific, really. Canute Road, which is down by the docks near Ocean Village now, where the White Star Line offices were, many people went down there to queue for news. They didn't know for days. Some people I interviewed for my book said that their relatives were told they were dead, and then the name was scrubbed off and put onto the survivors list. So you went from thinking someone was dead, then someone was alive, and just not knowing. I know that Emily only found out a few days later with the telegram that he was lost at sea, but it was never confirmed. The body was never found. So if you multiply that by all the other widows and families, just whatever happened to Emily, it was awful initially for them. And then I think just shocked because the women had no money coming in. In my book, I discovered that the Salvation Army stepped up straight away, a bit like what we're going through today. A lot of people didn't have the access to even get to food. So the Salvation Army would deliver emergency packages. And then it was only a few months later that we'll talk about later, but the Titanic Relief Fund started. And that's when they began to get a bit more sort of regular money. But at first, many of them were just plunged into poverty.
Julie, thank you. It's really interesting. The Titanic's become such a legend, and there's some big names associated with it. And we kind of know about people like Benjamin Guggenheim, etc. But we don't know so much about the crew. Why are they so often overlooked?
Well, I would say initially because the big names were the celebrities of the day. I mean, if you think back to Southampton, someone like Benjamin Guggenheim and the owners of Macy's, Isadora Strauss, and all these people, they were sort of like the the celebs of today coming to Southampton. So of course all the papers talked about them. These were sort of the oligarchs of the day, multi-millionaires. So I suppose they were just more well known, but I think the crew were just faceless, and I think they are certainly as well in dramatizations and sort of big blockbuster films. You know, we all know the characters, the Molly Brown and Benjamin Guggenheim, as you say, who famously put his top hat on and said, "I'm going down like a gentleman." These things have become almost mythical, these people in status. Whereas I think the crew, even in films, you don't really hear about their lives, who they were, why they were on the ship. So I think almost the media itself has perpetuated these sort of few big names, but I think also they had the chance to write about it. So if you survived Titanic and you went home to your beautiful house in New York or London or wherever you lived, and you were a rich person, you could talk about your feelings, you could write your feelings down or be interviewed. But a stoker who survived just went back to work. You know, there was no time to feel or to talk about it or to dwell on it. So I think that's why it's just the poverty has meant that their stories have got lost.
Tell us a bit more about those surviving men, the ones who had to go back to their lives and their jobs. What was life like for them?
I think initially a lot of the people I spoke to who had surviving relatives said that they simply didn't talk about it. I mean, that's a resounding thing I've had from a lot of them. They would not talk about it, whether that was just how men dealt with things then. You know, it wasn't like now where we encourage. I still don't think there are problems today with men talking about things, but we do encourage men more, I think, to talk about feelings and sort of post-traumatic stress and things like that. Back then, it just wasn't the norm, as you'd imagine, so men had to go back to work. I think firstly there was the economic reason, so they had to go and find work on another ship. So if you think you've survived Titanic, the last thing you'd want to do is get back on another ship, but that's exactly what a lot of them did. But also a lot of them were called cowards. One lady I interviewed for my book, her grandfather was a fireman who was told to row a lifeboat of people to safety. So because firemen were physically strong and fit, they were used as the rowers to get people away from the ship. He did that. He was ordered by officers to do that. He didn't choose to, but when he came back to Southampton, he was called a coward even by children on the streets. For many years, even up to his sort of 60s, 70s, he still had this awful, embarrassing feeling that he'd survived, which is terrible, really, but that's how it was. If you went down with the ship, you were a hero. If you survived, even if you'd saved other people, there was still that element of, well, why didn't you go down with it? You know, why did you survive?
Wow, that's a tragedy. You know, these people aren't remembered. And
yeah,
I mean, what you said earlier on about these famous names that we know, and you could go back to your wealthy, you know, New York penthouse or whatever stable and kind of write about these things. And do you think it's really become a rich person's tragedy?
I do, yeah. I certainly saw it like that all my life. Watching, as I mentioned, all the lavish blockbusters and films. I think Titanic, just in its very nature, because it was a beautiful ship and it was very opulent, that's how we initially think of it. I think people who sort of talk about Titanic tend to fall into two camps. They either love the ship and the way the ship looked and they're sort of obsessed with that, or they like the history side of it. But again, I think more and more we talk about the rich, the famous names. I think even as I was growing up, my father would tell me about my great grandfather, but I was far more interested if I watched a film on who was sitting in first class, you know, even me, because I think it's more glamorous. It's what we're more interested in. So it was only as I got older and I thought, well, hang on, there's this swathe of people that haven't really been talked about, and yes, they're not glamorous, but they've certainly, you know, got a lot of stories to tell.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Julie, you mentioned earlier about the Titanic Relief Fund, which was kind of what put in place to help the families which were left behind and who were bereaved. Tell us a bit more about that.
Yes, the Titanic Relief Fund started a few months later, and it was started by the Mayor of Southampton, Henry Bowyer, and also the Mayor of London in Mansion House in London. So they all got together because basically people wanted to send money and they didn't know where to send it. So money was coming in from around the world, massive donations in some cases. And so this began and it became the Titanic Relief Fund, and an amazing amount was raised. It was £412,000 was raised, which in our money now is sort of over £35 million. It's a lot of money. And so, yeah, they then put them into classes. So there was class A for the wives of officers and the sort of higher echelons of the ship. And then class G was wives of firemen, coal trimmers, stokers. So Emily, my great grandmother, was in class G. So she got 12 shillings a week for her, and the fact that she had her children. So depending on if you had children, you got more or less, which wasn't a lot of money to live on, but it was certainly really gratefully received, because it meant she could pay her rent, she could put food on the table. But she went quite quietly in there. I went through all the fund relief minutes in the archive in Southampton, and her name does show up, but not very often. There are a few others who, what I call in my book, sort of the women, the good, the bad, and the delicate. And there were some that were quite bad, in inverted commas, whose name pop up a lot because they're drinking heavily and being told off for spending their handout on alcohol, or there are some who are neglecting their children, and so it's quite interesting. They're really good social history records of how their money was used, depending on their characters, obviously.
So, Julie, I mean, we're talking about an event that happened, over 100 years ago now. Why is this such an enduring story?
I think because the Titanic disappeared. I think really because she's at the bottom of the ocean, the North Atlantic Ocean, and we can't get to her, we can't see her. I know a lot of people have gone down and done various sort of reconnoiters down there and sent images back, and some have said some people have sort of robbed the graves of people by getting artifacts back. But I think because she vanished and because she went down like that, it's almost like the sort of Mary Rose, this person, this ship that disappeared. I think that adds to the allure, but also just the fact that Titanic was the biggest, most opulent, most beautiful ship of all time, most would argue. I mean, I'm not hugely into the look of ships, but even I can say it was a beautiful looking ship,
Sure.
And it had all the mod cons of the day. It was just, nothing had ever been seen like Titanic before. So I think we're talking about it, I think, for those reasons. And also there's so many conspiracy theories around Titanic still. I mean, whatever you believe, some people say, oh, well, they should have known about the iceberg. Other people say it was an insurance job. Other people say she switched places with Olympic. I mean, there's so many ideas out there, conspiracy theory ideas. And I think it just fuels it. And I think it's a combination of all those factors, really.
Yeah, it's really interesting, really interesting. So, Julie, tell us a bit more about the book. Where can we get it? When's it available?
The book is out now, and it's published by Pen and Sword. It's called The Titanic and the City of Widows It Left Behind. It can be bought from Amazon or Waterstones or the usual places, and obviously they can deliver if you can't get to a bookshop at the moment. So it is able, hopefully, see you through some isolation. It is available now.
Awesome.
Julie was supposed to be hosting an event in 2 weeks' time, but it's obviously postponed. But yeah, when we schedule that again, which will hopefully be from September onwards, then we'll have online copies available as well.
That would be great.
Amazing.
Yeah, no, thank you.
Thank you, Julie. We look forward to having you at God's Tower soon.
Yes, thank you. I'm looking forward to it. It's just such a shame, it's been postponed. But as you say, it is postponed, not cancelled. So we will get there, and it'll be great to see everybody. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, we look forward to it.
Yes.
Thanks for joining us today, Julie.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
No worries. Thank you.
Right. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.